Okay, so you want to own a vineyard, rows of vines running in perfect lines up a hillside, a stone farmhouse at the top of the drive, a glass of something you grew yourself, poured on your own porch, while the sun goes down behind hills you own. Wake up to fog sitting low in the valley. Walk the rows in the morning with a cup of coffee, checking the fruit with your own hands. That's the picture. That's what the real estate listing photos are built to make you feel. And it's not a foolish thing to want. People have wanted exactly this for thousands of years. Here's what the listing doesn't show you: the well that runs dry in August, the frost alarm that goes off at 3 a.m. in April and sends you outside in the dark to run wind machines over vines that took 4 years to bear anything at all, the ton of grapes you finally harvested that a buyer down the road offered you $300 for. Because this year, nobody wants to buy fruit from anyone. Here's the problem: you are picturing a farm. What you are actually buying, if you do this right, is something closer to a luxury manufacturing operation that happens to grow its own raw material in a field instead of buying it from a supplier. And the moment you stop thinking of a vineyard as a farm and start thinking of it as a factory with a very long, very fragile supply chain sitting right there in the dirt, the entire economics of this business starts to make sense, including why some of the wealthiest wine regions on earth are currently ripping out tens of thousands of acres of the exact same land people are paying millions of dollars to buy. So let's say it plainly, because everything else in this video is just proof of this one sentence. A vineyard is not a farm. It is a luxury manufacturing line that happens to grow its own raw material, and almost all of the profit lives in the 4 inches of glass and label between the tank and the customer's hand, not in the dirt. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the same ton of grapes can be worth $300 or $22,000, depending on nothing except which side of the crush pad it's sold on, and why that single fact currently has entire American wine regions tearing out vines they spent decades planting. Let's start with what it costs to get in the door. Because there isn't one vineyard business, there are several stacked on top of each other, and most first time buyers only budget for the bottom layer, layer one, the raw land itself. In Napa County, currently the most expensive fruit growing dirt in America, vineyard land is averaging around $132,348 an acre, with the most prestigious hillside blocks running as high as $500,000 an acre. That's before you've planted a single vine. Layer two, establishing the vineyard on that land, clearing, soil prep, the trellis system, the irrigation lines, the vines themselves, and the labor to plant them, typically runs $25,000 to $60,000 per acre on top of the raw land, regardless of which region you're in. A standard vertical trellis system alone runs $4,000 to $8,000 an acre in materials and labor. Planting labor adds another $1,000 to $2,500 an acre if the property doesn't already have a reliable water source. You're drilling an agricultural well next, and in Northern California, that can run $35 to $130 a foot, landing most agricultural wells somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 once it's drilled and equipped, plus a county permit running $400 to $1,000. And in many groundwater basins, an additional review from a groundwater sustainability agency that can add another $500 to $5,000 or more. And that's still just the vineyard. If your plan is to actually make and sell wine rather than sell grapes to somebody else, add a production facility. A small winery producing 1,000 to 3,000 cases a year needs $100,000 to $300,000 in press, destimer, tanks, and bottling equipment alone, housed in a building that runs $150 to $400 a square foot to construct, $750,000 to $2 million for a modest 5,000 square foot facility. Here's the part almost nobody plans for correctly. It's not a fee, it's a formula, and it's buried in federal labeling law. Under 27 CFR Section 4.25, you are not legally allowed to put the name of your own American viticultural area on your own bottle unless at least 85% of the wine by volume actually came from grapes grown inside that AVA's mapped boundary. A state or county name only requires 75%. Buy the wrong parcel, one that sits just outside the drawn line, sometimes by a matter of a few hundred feet, and every bottle you make is legally barred from using the one word on the label that justifies the price you budgeted around. Stack the land, the establishment cost, the water infrastructure, the production facility if you're bottling your own wine, licensing, insurance, a cash reserve to survive the years before you're selling anything. And a serious vineyard winery estate can require anywhere from $500,000 for a small non Napa operation on modest acreage to well over $10 million once you're buying prime Ava land at scale. Now, here's the part of this business that actually explains everything else. And it starts with a question that sounds simple, which is worth more, a ton of grapes or the wine that ton makes? Most people assume the answer is roughly the same thing, just processed. It is not close to the same thing. 1 ton of wine grapes converts to roughly 60 gallons of finished wine, which works out to about 25 cases, or 300 bottles. In 2025, if you grew that ton in California's Central Valley and sold it as raw fruit, the statewide district average for that region was $336.08 a ton. Read that again, $336 for a ton of fruit that, bottled, becomes 300 individual products. Now take the same ton and grow it in Napa County instead, the most expensive wine grape market in the country, and sell it as raw fruit. You'd get $6,767.53 on average, and as much as $11,052 for a ton of Cabernet Franc. That's a real premium, nearly 20 times the Central Valley price, just for the address the vines are planted at. But now, don't sell the fruit at all. Bottle it. Take that same 1 ton, turn it into those same 300 bottles, and sell them yourself, direct to a customer standing in your tasting room, at a modest $35 a bottle. 300 bottles times $35 is $10,500 for the exact same ton of fruit that was worth $336 as Central Valley bulk fruit, and still worth less than that even sold as raw Napa fruit at nearly $7,000 a ton. Push the bottle price to $75, a realistic average for a mid-tier Napa Cabernet sold direct, and that same physical ton of grapes is now worth $22,500, more than 3 times what it earned as raw fruit in the single most expensive commodity grape market in America. The land didn't change. The vines didn't change. The grapes didn't change. The only thing that changed was which side of the crush pad the sale happened on. This is the entire structural secret of the wine business. Growing grapes is a commodity agriculture business with commodity agriculture margins, and it always will be, no matter how good your dirt is. Bottling and selling wine directly to a customer is a luxury retail and hospitality business with retail margins, and it behaves nothing like farming at all. The land, the vines, the weather, the labor, every single thing people picture when they picture a vineyard is just the cost of admission to the second business. The profit was never in the ground. It was always in the 4 inches of glass and label wrapped around what the ground produced. This is why direct to consumer sales, meaning tasting room visits and wine club shipments, have become the thing every serious winery obsesses over. Tasting room and wine club sales now account for roughly 53% of the average winery's total revenue, and wine clubs alone make up close to 39% of all direct consumer sales. Direct sales routinely capture 50% gross margin or better on every bottle because you're keeping the full retail price. Sell that exact same bottle through the traditional 3-tier wholesale system instead, through a distributor, onto a retail shelf, and your margin drops to somewhere around 20% to 30% because you're now selling at a steep discount to everyone standing between you and the final customer. Same bottle, same grapes, same labor, and the margin can be cut in half or more depending purely on which channel it moves through. Now let's talk about the operating grind, because a mature vineyard doesn't run itself, and the bills don't wait for harvest the way the checks do. If you farm the vineyard yourself, ongoing cultural practices, pruning, canopy management, spraying, weed control, all of it, run $4,000 to $6,500 an acre every single year. Hire a vineyard management company to do it instead, and that jumps to $6,500 to $9,500 an acre annually, climbing as high as $30,000 an acre in the most competitive luxury markets, where you're paying for specialized expertise as much as labor. Manual, non harvest labor alone runs roughly $924 to $1,220 or more per acre, depending on the region. Oregon growers, who lean much harder on hand labor than Washington growers, spend close to 4 times as much per acre on labor as their Washington counterparts. Then harvest itself. Hand picking runs about $250 a ton, and at a yield of 7 tons an acre, that's roughly $1,750 an acre just to bring the fruit in. Much of that labor now runs through the federal H-2A program, with a current listed California vineyard wage of $16.90 an hour. And here's a structural fork almost every new owner hits without realizing it. Do you farm the land yourself, taking on the labor risk and the management burden directly? Or do you contract it out to a management company and pay the premium for someone else to carry that risk? Self farming is cheaper on paper and disastrous the first time you're shorthanded during a 3-day window when the fruit is exactly ripe and the forecast says rain. A management company costs more every single year, but it converts a labor emergency into a line item. Neither choice is wrong, but whichever you make, it's a cost that recurs every year, regardless of how the harvest turns out. Here's the deep cut almost nobody outside the industry knows about, and it can quietly override every other financial decision you've made. Napa County's agricultural preserve, in place since 1969, allows enrolled vineyard land to be taxed at its restricted agricultural value instead of full market value. A huge break on a property that might otherwise carry a tax bill in the hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. But to qualify, the parcel has to be zoned agricultural preserve or agricultural watershed, has to be at least 10 acres if it's prime agricultural land or 40 acres if it isn't, and has to be enrolled under a rolling 10-year contract. That contract doesn't just lower your tax bill, it also restricts what you're ever allowed to do with the land. No subdividing it, no converting it to something else, for as long as the contract runs and renews. The same signature that makes the land affordable to hold every year is the signature that can make it nearly impossible to ever sell for anything other than more vineyard. People buy the dream of the land. Very few of them read the zoning contract that comes attached to it. So far, so good. Now, let's talk about what can actually go wrong, because vineyards fail, and they fail in ways that have nothing to do with anyone being lazy or making bad wine. Go back to the 1980s. UC Davis, the leading agricultural research institution in American viticulture, had recommended a rootstock called AXR1 since the 1960s, and growers across California planted it in good faith because it looked disease resistant and grafted easily. Then, starting in 1982, a new biotype of Phylloxera, the root louse, that had already wiped out European vineyards a century earlier, appeared in Napa Valley, and it turned out AXR1 had no real resistance to it at all. Vines don't die instantly. Root systems fail slowly over years, which meant growers watched entire blocks decline before understanding what was happening. By the time the scope was clear, an estimated 2/3 of Napa Valley's vineyards, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 acres, had to be torn out completely and replanted on resistant rootstock at an industry wide cost exceeding $1 billion. This was not a mistake made by careless growers cutting corners. It was the officially recommended path, planted deliberately across an entire region that looked completely sound for 2 full decades before it failed all at once. Now, here's where it gets dangerous, because that pattern didn't stay in the history books. Between October of 2024 and August of 2025, California growers removed nearly 40,000 acres of vineyard, about 7.5% of the state's total wine grape acreage, in a single 10-month stretch. The 2025 crush, the total tonnage of grapes actually processed, came in at under 2.5 million tons, the smallest crush the state has recorded since the start of the century, down from 2.9 million tons the year before, and far below the roughly 4 million ton average of the mid 2000s. That collapse left an estimated 1.2 million tons of grapes with no buyer at all. grown, ripened, and in some cases left to rot on the vine because no winery would take them. This wasn't a bad weather year, it was demand. Total US wine consumption fell about 6% in 2024 and kept sliding through 2025, driven by an aging customer base, health conscious, younger drinkers who simply drink less of it, and competition from other categories entirely. Total industry sales revenue fell by nearly $19.7 billion, about 21% in 5 years, from $94 billion in 2020 down to $74.3 billion in 2025. Named companies felt this directly. Vintage Wine Estates filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2024, carrying $400 million in debt. Aloria Vineyards, a 30-year-old California winery, filed Chapter 11 to try to keep operating as a going concern. Both cases point at the exact same structural lesson as the AXR1 collapse 4 decades earlier. A vineyard's revenue depends on assumptions locked in years before the harvest that finally tests them, whether that assumption is about a rootstock's disease resistance or about how many Americans will still want to buy a bottle of wine a decade from now. Vines can't be recosted overnight, so an entire region can be committed, acre after acre, to a bet that quietly stops being true long before anyone notices. And when the correction comes, it doesn't arrive one grower at a time. It arrives industry wide, all at once. Now let's put the actual numbers together, out loud, the way an owner has to. Take a 20-acre estate vineyard winery, mature and fully planted. Annual farming costs at roughly $5,000 an acre across 20 acres runs about $100,000 a year. Add facility overhead, insurance, and debt service on the establishment financing, and call the fixed annual cash cost of running this estate $150,000 a year, an illustrative, round number built from the ranges above, not a precise figure for any one property. Each bottle sold direct through the tasting room or wine club nets, somewhere around $15 to $20 of contribution margin after bottling and packaging costs, because direct sales capture that 50% plus retail margin instead of the thin wholesale cut. Call it $17.50 a bottle. Divide $150,000 by $17.50, and this estate needs to sell roughly 8,600 bottles a year, about 715 cases, direct to consumer, just to break even. That's the fruit from somewhere around 8 to 12 producing acres, sold entirely through the tasting room and wine club, even though the vineyard itself is 20 acres. And that's the trap door. Whatever fruit the tasting room and wine club can't personally absorb doesn't just disappear. It has to be sold off as bulk juice or bulk wine at commodity prices instead. The same commodity prices that fell to a statewide average of $978.60 a ton in 2025. That's not growth. That's the exact same mechanism playing out on one estate's balance sheet that produced a 1.2 million ton statewide glut when it happened everywhere at once. So here are the two futures. In the optimistic scenario, your vineyard sits in an established, respected AVA. Your sales mix runs heavily direct to consumer with a healthy wine club and steady tasting room traffic. The weather cooperates. Under those conditions, a small estate producing 3,000 to 5,000 cases a year can generate $800,000 to $1.5 million in annual revenue at the 15% to 20% net profit margin, and establish winery targets once it's fully up and running, putting owner take home somewhere around $120,000 to $300,000 a year. Genuinely solid for the capital and the years involved. In the realistic scenario, nothing dramatic happens. A spring frost trims yield by roughly a third, an ordinary, forgettable weather event in this business. National wine consumption, already down about 6% and still sliding, softens your tasting room's walk-in traffic a little. The fruit your tasting room and wine club can't sell gets pushed into that oversupplied bulk market at $978.60 a ton instead of bottled at $35 or $75 a bottle. Your vineyard management contract and your crop insurance both renew a little higher than last year. No fire, no scandal, no single bad decision, just a slightly lighter harvest, a slightly quieter tasting room calendar, and a bulk market, absorbing your surplus at a fraction of what it would have earned bottled, compounding quietly across 12 months. The gap between those two ordinary years on an estate this size can run well over $200,000. The difference between a genuinely good living and a loss, without a single headline worthy event to explain it. So if you do decide to buy the land, plant the rows, and wait out those first 4 quiet years before the vines give you anything worth selling, remember what you're actually building. The dirt was never the business. The 4 inches between the tank and the customer's hand always were. Grow the grapes if you love the land. Get rich, if you get rich at all, in the space between the vine and the bottle.